Hello, everyone. This is Sharon Munoz, and this is my summary of my reflection on the worship service I attended and my interview with Pastor Ron from a Church of the Nazarene congregation. So the service was centered on 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 14 to 21, and focused on imitation as a model for discipleship. So a key idea of the sermon was that spiritual formation doesn't happen through instruction alone, and the Pastor Ron had used the analogy of parenthood, saying that children learn more and catch more from our behaviors as parents rather than catching what we say. So, but he said through relationships, accountability, and observing how others actually live out their faith is how spiritual formation takes place. And for my interview, it was clear that Pastor Ron approaches worship with a goal of moving people from simply hearing the word to actively living it out. He was very encouraging in his tone and just in his word choice, and that focus does show up not only in what he was preaching that day, but also in how the service is structured and how really he tries to plan everything out. So he described a very full schedule. He balances his role as senior pastor with family life of 5 kids, leadership in the Nazarene Youth Missions Academy, and many other responsibilities. So, even with that, his sermon preparation is intentional and shaped by prayer, scripture study, and trying to discern what his congregation needs. But he emphasized heavily that his first ministry is his family, which does directly inform how he understands leadership and credibility in preaching. And theologically, his perspective reflects Nazarene beliefs, especially the idea that salvation is a gift from God that still requires a response. And that shows up in his preaching style. It's what he continued to reference throughout his whole sermon, and that it's com- still completely invitational, um, and not just, informative. And yeah, looking at the structure of the worship service, it was a very simple pattern. There's two opening worship songs, a much longer sermon of about 45 minutes, and then a closing song followed by, or sorry, there was an altar call, and then it ended with a closing song. But that structure, to me, although it was different, I could see how it kind of preps the congregation to engage. And then, they carries them from like the songs that are kind of opening themselves up to focusing on scripture and then to responding and having an opportunity to respond, and being prayed for as well if they did respond. So the altar call reinforced that emphasis on the response. It didn't feel forced. I personally didn't respond to the altar call. I know there were a few people, but it really does give that opportunity for people to act on what they heard from the sermon. And yeah, another thing is context does play a huge role. Pastor Ron was very descriptive on the type of congregation that he serves and, in the town that he serves. So the church is located in an agricultural community where people are closely tied to the land. And so they naturally, he describes it as people already naturally kind of depending on God. Because again, it's agriculture. If a crop fails, then they don't eat, and there's less money. But the church is also, not only do they engage with people from those backgrounds, but the church also actively engages with people dealing with addiction, poverty, domestic abuse, many social challenges. And so the preaching, he says, and he knows that has to speak to everyday faith, but also very real life situations. And overall, though, what I took away from the experience is that worship planning and preaching are not just about delivering so and so from this scripture. It has to involve theology, context, and lived examples of kind of it all blending together, and all working together. So the and Pastor Ron says this, and I got that from his sermon as well, but the effectiveness of the message is closely tied to how it's embodied, not just how it's communicated. And essentially that wraps up like the big piece of advice that I got from him as someone who would like to be in ordained ministry, is just that, is like we have to live out what we're preaching. I think he said that that's a given, and we know that internally, but to live it out is a completely different challenge. And again, sometimes it's a balancing act. And yeah, so, but I look forward to hearing feedback from others and listening to what other experiences were like. Thank you.